Okay, hello everyone. Hello, Anna, Dana, and Mika. I would like to warmly welcome you as our guest today. As we have a very beautiful, complex topic to unfold, we are going to talk about the topic of tourism. And to our audience, I also wish a very good evening, morning, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. Now, before we begin and start with the proceeding, I would like to introduce the topic today and also our guests. The topic of tourism is now at the center of many conversations, especially as it pertains to the urgent need of subjecting the sector to a radical transformation and making it more accountable towards the communities that it affects. And since Collective Rewilding has been researching the topic for a while now, we were very excited to see the overlapping interest in this topic as we came across the Slim magazine and the issue of that was published recently, the Adria issue. So we have reached out to the editors, Anna Beroš, Mika, Savela, and Henrik Drufwa, and we're very happy today to have them in this conversation. So to start off, I would like to invite both of you to introduce maybe yourselves and also tell us more about the collaboration you had with the production of the magazine in particular, but also about selling projects in general.
Well, maybe I'll start to say that as you nicely put it, we are both architects with Anadana. My name is Mika Savela. I'm architect working also as a curator and editor based in Helsinki, and I'm sort of the other half of Salim together with Henrik, who is in spirit with us, but not taking part now. But so Salim is a kind of a sort of a design agency, but more operating as this platform for editorial and curatorial projects, which we have founded basically just to have a sort of a more interdisciplinary setup that doesn't have to be like a sort of a part of the design industry in that sense always, but we still kind of operate on this arts, architecture, design interfaces and landscape, and sometimes trying to do things a little bit more in a more lighter way, and also in a, let's say, like light-hearted way, so that it's not always about like kind of grinding everything into a thing, but at the same time trying to be very socially fueled and kind of try to think of things in the long term, trying to make things sort of sustainable in that way as well. So a little bit that about the background. About Anadana, perhaps I should let her speak for herself, how we come to work on this project together.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Mika. Thank you, Sabine. So my name is Anadana Beroš. I'm a trained architect, but sort of work in expanded field of architecture on the rim of art and activism. Mika, Henrik, and I've met through a project called Publishing Acts that was actually dealing with publishing as a spatializing act, and a sort of a migratory school dealing with the cities on the Croatian Adriatic coast since 2017. We've met in Pula and dealt with the topics of demilitarization of the city, the industrialization of the city, and of course the mass terrification of the city of Pula. And these are the problems that are very much present in most of the coastal cities, not only in the Adriatic, but around the globe. I myself, as a researcher, as a documentarist as well, have been dealing with topics of migration, so some sort of a upside down sphere of tourism in terms of mobility. And this started many years ago, but one of the important projects was in 2014 that was actually focusing on the little island of Lampedusa in Italy, but actually geologically being part of the African continent. And it was one of the very first encounters of beautiful beaches, named the most beautiful beaches in the world in 2017. This is the beach of the Rabbits Beach on Lampedusa, which is actually, of course, one of the sites of the disembarkments of people on the move coming from the south to European territory. And Mika and I have been working ever since Pula in other coastal cities and exchanging ideas about spatial imaginaries of Croatian coastal cities in years. And so it seemed so natural to continue on this special issue of Adria, which is like the 7th issue of Slim's fanzine.
Yeah, thank you for the overview. And as you mentioned, we will talk more about the effects of tourism and how architecture is connected to that, but also about migration and mobility as also one major part of the tourist industry. One thing that we see as extremely problematic when thinking about tourism is the so-called tourist gaze and the dangers that come with it. While we were doing our research, we were also questioning if the tourist gaze has managed to transform places that were previously considered maybe ugly or even more problematic associated with colonial histories into making them authentic and natural and also attractive for the tourists. Like in the instance that we had with the artist Anneli Davis. So we had interviewed her to better understand the struggle against mass tourism in Barbados and the mega developments by the sector of the sector in the Caribbean. So while questioning the future of a landscape caught between the sugar industry and the association with the slavery and the development of the tropical islands as an exoticized playground for foreigners, we had to ask what is the danger of the gaze and how it affects the conversion of the cities into lands and lands into images or merchandises. And what I find particularly interesting is how the question of tourism is connected to architecture and urban planning and development. So the question would be then, in your opinion, how does the architecture, or does it at all play a role in transforming the territories, and does it partake in this perpetuation of the tourist gaze into like making the cities as like postcard elements?
Okay. Mika, will you go? Or
well, maybe I'll go a little bit back to as a sort of a short answer, yes. But then I'll go back to a little bit our start, I guess, with the Adria project, because so our collaboration also started, and I think it's sort of important to note that as we come from Finland, and which is, I mean, we do experience some sort of tourism, but not in these not in the same sense as the Croatian coast. And since we had all these experiences, sort of visiting the workshops together that we were doing in Pula or in Šibenik or on the Makarska coast, or then in these sort of super visited sites on the Croatian coast, I think like to have that kind of confrontation with cities and villages and sites that have been so impacted with tourism, is also like a realization, because we don't necessarily come from the same setting. So becoming a little bit more acquainted with like rather than just seeing a city or visiting a beach, but sort of like being more embedded in the histories and kind of the well, the people living in these sites. It was a little bit like a kind of a threshold to first understand like how much things are dramatically different than they are, for instance, to our perception. And then we can start to talk about, the impacts of tourism and how urban design, urban planning, how architecture, how the sort of development narrative has, the modernization has sort of been tangled with that. So that's very much in the background for our part. But then in general, obviously, we can think, and maybe Anadana can more elaborate on that. But I guess in general, obviously, like we are looking at a phenomenon that is very kind of like old, but then at the same time, sort of like the mass tourism culture is such a kind of like a new layer on top of it. So what do we see when we think about architecture related to tourism? I think that happens in so many levels, where we can see like the most beautiful sort of like versions of architecture being related to how luxurious resorts and kind of like natural surroundings are being framed as these experiences. And surely these can be exceptional architecturally speaking, and sort of like the design framework of it all. But then at the same time, there is a sort of a ton of other infrastructure and sort of junk space that kind of exists because of tourism as the main narrative of development. So there's also that. So in one way, if the architecture is the 1%, then there's also the 99% of something else that exists. That's one way of looking at it for sure.
No, absolutely. I can follow up on that. Actually, what is the role of architecture in the tourist gaze? It's actually completely about what is made invisible, what is invisibilized. There is a lot of machinery, a lot of mechanism involved in turning the gaze toward the postcard picture views, and actually what is in the background. So not just in the aesthetical terms of actually experiencing a city, it is about the entire tourism industry that is underneath, under the soil, or covered, whether we look at in the realm of work, of migrant work, the entire facilities of accommodation, or actually the missing of the adequate accommodation for the migrant workers here in Croatia. That is a big issue of actually this influx now, not only people coming from Europe as migrant workers during the summer season, etc., but literally coming from the entire world. And this sort of globalization is something that is happening in the last few years, except for the pandemic, but even during the pandemic, and is something that was in a way expected, but still we were not prepared for it. So just to be quite literal in these terms of the tourist infrastructure, unvisible, turned invisible, or the beautiful postcard in the case of the city of Dubrovnik, the pearl of the Adriatic Sea, as it is called in the mainstream media, is the case of a beautiful belvedere, of a hill underneath the mountain of Srđ in Dubrovnik, Žarkovica Hill, that was in the modernist era a beautiful bistro or beautiful restaurant that is now actually housing some sort of a illegal animal shelter, where more than 400 stray dogs are being homed, are actually now being eradicated. The entire establishment to clean, the city, even the outskirts of the city, to be cleaned for this perfect experience of the old town of Dubrovnik, etc.
Yeah, it is quite shocking. This is especially the case in Venice, where the city became kind of kept in time, where all sorts of developments are impossible due to the fact that you have to kind of maintain this image of the city that is attractive and that brings so much tourists. But obviously there are a lot of issues with that. Another big issue that we came across when we were preparing for this talk was actually something that really struck me, and ever since I cannot stop thinking about it, and it was the question of tourism and migration, as both are forms of mobility. However, there is like a very clear attitude, almost a racist attitude, that shapes the idea of who is regarded a tourist and who is not regarded a tourist. Recently, I came across a very interesting example of the kind of a legal construction of tourism and labor, and the migration that happened in the post-war period in Europe, in France, Switzerland, West Germany, and so on. So basically, it is connected to the opportunity for entering a country as a tourist, and then looking for work, and thus gaining access to the market, which was kind of regarded acceptable. However, now with the changing economic conditions and the will to stop immigration, it is seen as a threat, and people who come as tourists from especially Southern Europe are generally suspected of doing so in order to find illegal employment, and they're now being labeled as Vortourists, or in German there's a term that really struck me. It was Pseudotouristen or falsche Touristen, like fake tourists. And this is especially then also visible on a larger scale, not only within Europe, also as migrants in Europe and in the US are trying to enter from underdeveloped countries, as you mentioned, Anna, at Lampedusa. There are much stricter regulations, which bring us to question and understand the complexity, to better understand the complexity, which is the intersection between economic, social, and cultural aspects in defining the status of the people on the move and how they are treated. So there is obviously the question of how the classification of people doing the same activity is taken into account when we study, tourism and migration. Yeah.
Yes, I would completely agree with you, Sabina, especially saying we are talking about racial profiling, not maybe racial profiling. And actually, just to give you an example of what is happening today in Croatia, a European member state that will enter Schengen zone beginning of next year. People on the move that are illegalized are sort of in a regular position, getting the popularly called 7 days paper, some sort of a permit to stay within the territory of Europe and then voluntarily exit. Of course, people are using this sort of document to cross and enter deeper in the European continent, and while doing so, they do obtain all the human rights, and they are using public means of public transportation, but they're paying extra, either with the taxi fares or even with the double ticketing of train fares and this and that. And it's amazing to see, that some sort of a Western European traveler would pay, let's say, 100 euros for a train ride, or less, from somewhere, let's say, Vienna to Split, and a migrant traveler would pay more and have more dangerous and complex trips. So there is like the entire migrant industry behind it. We could compare it with the tourism industry in this sort of gray area in which they coincide and overlap with having different kind of fares, not just to talk about the jeopardy of lives that are that are in concern. Yes, Mika.
Yeah, I mean, I also started to think a little bit about the historical framework of tourism, because the way that we kind of understand tourism right now in today's world is sort of as some sort of development that starts from the grand tours of the wealthy, I guess, Western European powers, and I guess more the idle upper class men who were able to kind of like include this lessons of the classical art and the kind of romantic understanding of culture as such to be included in their youth before they then marry and spend their days in somewhere else. So that somehow lies in the background, and then afterwards in the late 19th century, we get like the first sort of travel guide books, the Baedekers and these kinds of mini guidebooks, so that people started to really travel, and also rather widely to sort of at least from Western Europe to sort of more exotic places, like Egypt or Palestine or Jerusalem or the Middle East in general, and then these all around the Mediterranean. And I think like we, even from those, we still get to see that somehow people are already understood tourism as some sort of a activity that you can enjoy, but more so if there aren't any other tourists. So that kind of is very early on, that only if the idea that if this white European person is brave enough to travel and sort of like go through the obstacles to find this unspoiled lands and discover the sort of authentic or ethnic or historical surroundings, then only through that can we add something to our own experiences. And that kind of mentality somehow is still there in the background. But then at the same time, it's also like or at least this is my reading, that somehow at least those grand tours kind of like saw the ruins as part of the ancient ruins of Greece and Roman era, as somehow part of the original white Western civilization that had sort of been overrun by these other people and the others. So we do have already there this kind of like a kind of a mismatch of cultures, like why the visitors would come in to sort of like seek their authentic cultural noble roots, and then you have these people who are just peasants or kind of like working around the ruins that they don't even understand or something like this. So that whole image to me is so deeply embedded still in this idea that and obviously things are super different now. We have mass tourism, or at least have had before the COVID, but this is somehow there when we think about like who is really the tourist and who is the native, and this is also partly false understanding, because I think if we really think about, I guess, the ancient era of like how what the Mediterranean, how multi-ethnic, how multilingual, a sort of like a sea of connections it has been. I think we only perceive tourism from this angle because that's sort of the history that we can chart from as a sort of a contemporary experience.
That is exactly also one of the issues that I see when it comes to mass tourism. Oh, we have 10 minutes. Mass tourism is the question for me at least, this idea of democratizing travel. So mass tourism comes with the idea of offering cheaper accommodation, cheaper ways of traveling, so everyone can travel, but it's still deeply rooted in the idea of like, who is this everyone who can travel to this day? And I find it quite interesting because there is a big rise in interest of, as you said, unspoiled places. And unspoiled places are usually those places where no tourist has gone before. And it is still a perpetuation of this exoticized world that is out there for us to take over and just go there and take everything that it has to offer. However, since we are running low on time, I would like to maybe, or Anna, Dana, did you want to add something to the conversation?
I mean, regarding this unspoiled gems of territory, they're literally unfound now in contemporary Croatia. For instance, all those pristine beaches, cliffy rocks, places. Now, of course, they're all on some tourist maps and highly populated. So it's very difficult to find a place to hide from the others, wanted or unwanted. Just to add that.
For the final part of this talk, I actually would like to kind of talk more about the collective rewilding's interest in tourism, and maybe ask you to give us a comment and, I don't know, critique or just add anything to our questions, because our interest mostly is connected with the correlation between tourism and hospitality, and especially trying to think about hospitality within the museum and art institutions. So when we started our inquiry, it was more with the question of the biennalization of the world, of the art world, that was undoubtedly coming hand in hand with the exponential growth of democratization of tourism and people traveling around the world. And this kind of tourism is called artistic tourism. So you travel from the Biennale to the Documenta to there and there. It especially partakes in the perpetuation of the climate violence around the world, because you're definitely, a tourist who is going to places just in order to take a look at an art institution. So knowing how mass tourism has become one of the largest extractivist economies, we are claiming that tourism can no longer become a secondary or marginal topic for cultural institutions. A lot of conversation that is happening now around the questions of sustainability in the art world are mostly around the understanding of how sustainability has to be in relation to carbon footprint or minimizing waste production and so on. But what we see is that there is like a lack of understanding how art institutions are creating spaces for mass consumption, and in that sense also for mass tourism. So for us it is kind of clear that we can no longer advance an institutional critique that looks at museums' content without interrogating forms of extractivism connected to the issues of tourism. So in that regard, my question, or rather my invitation, would be to ask you both, how do you see the idea of holding the art institutions and the art world and their practitioners accountable for the tourism and the issues in tourism?
Well, I would say that there is a sort of maybe a lesson that we've followed a little bit when making the Adria issue of the Slim zine, because I think when we first started with the zine, it was kind of like coming from that kind of understanding that when you're a creative individual working in the arts and design and architecture, there are so many international opportunities and that particular era that we may not ever experience again. Like there was this sort of a time when it was seen as kind of like professional goals and development, like the more you're exposed and traveling and all the time appearing in places. And we tried to work with this zine to sort of like create more meaning around these like brief moments of interaction, of like workshop here, workshop there, like what do we ever keep in touch afterwards. So now we're like, let's say in the deeper end of that part, I guess, with Anadana, because we've already been working on for some of these issues for a much lengthier period of time than we perhaps originally thought. So I think that experience, maybe if it sort of can be scaled up, is that that certainly, I mean, I've been very, and we've been at Selim kind of like very, you know, it's been wonderful to be experiencing so many hospitable situations in while traveling with Anadana and in these sites in Croatia, for instance. But we kind of like view that as our interactions with art institutions or individuals and so on. But the problem, I guess, is that if this can happen in our little context, how can it be scaled up? But I think like yeah, it is the scale of institutions that can at least somehow start the process. Like, what do you really gain from that experience of visiting? Is it like if people are looking for more complex experiences, like intellectually or artistically or aesthetically, that are related to that place or that site or that you know, country or the whatever city that they're visiting, then those institutions are in a position, I think, to offer that. Like, it's sort of not to go back to only the expected sort of forms of exchange, but just also to allow that sort of intellectual investment to take place.
In replying to your question, Sabina, I would go immediately into the institutional critique and the so-called right to host, or the hospitality that is given and not given from the institutions and art institutions in particular. I can immediately speak of a case happening now. Nowadays in Croatia, along the new Eastern Mediterranean routes that are connecting the city of Zagreb with the city of Rijeka, the former European capital of culture in 2020, just across the street of the new museum, who is organizing special pedagogical programs on the museum of welcoming, etc., on the museums of inclusion, especially thinking in terms of marginalized groups and migrant and asylum seeking groups of people. Just across the museum, there is the main railway station in Rijeka, on which there are groups of 200 of people staying overnight and continuing their journey into the depths of Europe, who are not getting any sort of support, not even the logistical support of a power outlet from a museum for simple actions as charging cell phones, etc. And we are talking about art museums, the ones who are supposed to be the avant-garde in opening up to communities and involving people in. It's not just in relation to the marginalized groups, or what we're talking about, this sort of mass consumerism, or I mean, with these terms of mass cultural consumption, etc. But museums should stop being elitist palaces of knowledge and become more inviting, become more two-way sided, how to say it, literally open. I have been mentioning the Kantian right to host, or the idea of hospitality in making of the perpetual peace with all the cosmopolitan values, that no man entering the museum as an alien and should be treated as an enemy. but invited.
Yeah, I think this was wonderful because we kind of get very much when we think about these complex topics, it very, very quickly becomes overwhelming where as a museum, as an institution or art practitioner, we are not really sure if we can solve the problem. But at the same time, it's just those simple acts, as you mentioned. And I think this is, Anadana, an amazing example of how a museum can rewild itself in the sense that it is offering something that a museum traditionally would never, consider offering. I would like to thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation, and thank you once again for joining and agreeing on this small collaboration. It was a lot of fun, and we had so much pleasure learning more about everything that you have been doing, and we want to thank you for your amazing work. This is quite a complex topic, and I don't think we made it any easier with this conversation. However, it is about the act of asking questions and creating awareness for the topics that are very difficult. And to our audience, I would like to invite you to participate with your comments and critiques or input in the comment section. And thank you for joining us and for tuning in. I wish you all a very nice rest of your day.
Thank you, Sabina, and thank you.
Thanks for having us.
For the, yes, to the